Good evening and welcome to the School of Advanced Study at the University of London. I'm Barry Smith, the Director of the Institute of Philosophy, and I will be chairing tonight's Open for Discussion panel. Now, these are an annual series of panel discussions which try to bring people from different perspectives to consider some of the critical issues that we need to face and that we probably need to discuss together. Tonight's seminar is not that. Tonight's panel discussion is going to be on the topic that's been the focus of all our lives for most of the last year of 2020, and that's COVID-19 and how we deal with it. Tonight's panel session is asking whether, as humanities scholars, we must remain on the outside looking in, or whether we should have a sage for the humanities or should have humanities scholars on sage. During the COVID pandemic, the government has been closely advised by the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, including experts across all sorts of scientific and medical disciplines, but it hasn't taken the step that has happened in Germany of including humanities scholars in the range of experts consulted. Should it do so here? And do we need some other perspectives to bring and inform the decisions that are going to affect all of our lives? Can we learn how to live with the virus, or can we trace a route out of it and to building the new way the future will be for all of us by drawing on the work of anthropologists, historians, philosophers, political theorists, lawyers, literary scholars, and those from the creative and cultural sector? Should we be asking them for their decisions and judgments about how our future should be? Well, with me to help us answer these questions are Lyndsey Stonebridge. Lyndsey is Interdisciplinary Professor of Humanities and Human Rights at the University of Birmingham and the author of Placeless People, Writing, Rights and Refugees, The Judicial Imagination, Writing After Nuremberg, and a recent collection of essays, Writing and Writing, not something you can make sense of in speech, but one is with a W, one's with an R, Literature in the Age of Human Rights, and that was published last month by Oxford University Press. She's also currently hard at work producing a critical and creative book about Hannah Arendt, and that's due to come out in 2022. Jo Wolff is the Alfred Landecker Professor of Values and Public Policy at the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford. He's also currently the co-chair of the Ethics and Governance Working Group for the World Health Organization, looking at ethical issues across the global response to COVID. His books include works on disadvantage, ethics and public policy, and an introduction to moral philosophy. And many of you will know him as a regular contributor to The Guardian, where he has a column on higher education. Subhadra Das is a museum curator at UCL. She is a writer and a historian specializing in the history and legacy of eugenics and scientific racism. And I would encourage you to look at her TEDx talk on those topics. We hope to be joined when technical issues subside by Philippe Sands, and I will introduce him when he arrives, technology permitting. Also, is he there? Have we got Philippe with us? Great. Oh, Philippe, welcome. Good to have you here. So Philippe Sands QC is a professor of law at University College London. He's a practicing barrister at Matrix Chambers and a prize-winning author. As a lawyer, he appears as a counsel before international courts and tribunals and sits as an international arbiter. He has written several academic books on international law, but is known to many of you as the author of East-West Street, The Origins of Crimes Against Humanity and Genocide, and most recently, The Rat Line, Love, Lies and Justice on the Trail of a Nazi Fugitive, which, as many of you know, was made into a very successful BBC podcast. Sadly, Professor Jeremy Farrar can't be with us this evening, and he sends his apologies, and he was delighted that instead we will be joined by, and is very grateful to, Anthony Costello. So Anthony is the former director of the Institute for Global Health at the University of London and was, until March 2018, Director of Maternal, Child and Adolescent Health at the World Health Organization. He's a professor of global health and the author of The Social Edge, The Power of Sympathy Groups for Our Health, Wealth and Sustainable Future, but many of you will know him as a member of Independent Sage. We will have a surprise appearance by Karl Friston, who is a professor of neuroscience at University College London, part of the Wellcome Centre for Neuroimaging, and also a contributor to Independent Sage. And where we have opportunity, we'll bring Karl in along with Anthony to tell us about some of the issues of modeling and the issues of decision-making on Independent Sage. So welcome, all of you. Glad to have you with us. I thought I'd start by asking each of you the same question, and that is, in the course of this pandemic and everything that we've learned from it, what has most surprised you? What facts have come to light, or what finding has most surprised you? And I want to start with you, if I may, Anthony.
Oh, difficult. I guess what most surprised me was the press conference on March the 12th, the very first one, because in a sense we'd had secret February. So if you go back, I mean, the first case of COVID was December the 7th in China. China more or less suppressed everything up until they confessed it to WHO on December the 31st. They then kept things quiet at home domestically right up till January the 20th. And then, of course, it all exploded. And then China moved into a very progressive mode and really began to get things under control. But it was clearly, by the end of January, I think everyone knew this was the big one. This was not flu. It was transmitting at almost 3 times the rate of flu, which has a huge effect on exponential spread. It had a fatality rate that was probably going to be around 5 to 10 times that of the average seasonal flu. But in February, we didn't really know what was going on because we didn't know what the SAGE was. We didn't know who was on it. We didn't get any feedback or anything. And then in March, things began to happen. You know, Italy, Iran had spread out from everywhere. And then you get this almost incredible press conference where people stand up and, you know, respected medics and scientists and say the spread of this virus is inevitable, which it wasn't because by then China and South Korea controlled it, that suppression and testing were basically a waste of time. They backtracked on that, but they stopped it in the community. They claimed that herd immunity would solve the problem with 60% of us all getting it, and then they backtracked on that. They said that behavior restrictions would be poorly tolerated, which actually they weren't. I mean, the British public have done an amazing job. I mean, it's beginning to...
Yeah, so I feel...
Anyway, and people would self-isolate, which they didn't. So all of these reasons, yeah, I found that really shocking and has kind of led to Indie Sage.
So I suspect we'll get into many of those issues, and I want to come back to you and pick them up. But clearly there's a surprise that Sage were not delivering what you might have expected from them, hence Independent Sage. Same question to Lyndsey. What most surprised you?
Well, I was pretty surprised to be in the middle of a worldwide pandemic. That was quite a surprise. And I think as a humanities scholar, I found myself to be very surprised to be in so much science all of a sudden, as if my life depended on it, which it indeed did and does. But I think the thing that stayed with me, Barry, was the couple of weeks into lockdown, the first couple of weeks of lockdown, and when we had that still calm of something like a quiet consensus, like that kind of really fresh spring air. And it stayed with me because of its clarity. And it seemed that that moment, it was a very short moment, it seemed as if we all agreed roughly that we were sharing something like the same reality. And then the period Anthony's described and the period after that, I think what's been really damaging and very terrifying is the fact that we don't seem to be sharing the same reality. And the way that our grasp of reality, a shared sense of evidence, a shared sense of common sense, has led to some very bad decision making. And I think it's been morally and psychologically catastrophic as well. So what really stays with when I'm an even older woman, what will stay with me are those moments where we seem to be on the same page. And that was, I think, because we'd locked down and there was a sense that we were coming to terms with reality. And then that went again.
Barry, you're muted.
A very strange sense in which we were participating in a great collective action, and it required us to do nothing but to ensure that we did nothing together and that other people did nothing. And that was the sense we were all in it together. I agree. Philippe, what has surprised you in this strange time?
Oh, well, you know, it's interesting. One of the things that surprised me is how amazingly adaptable human beings are. I mean, who would have thought that 9 months on, certainly, I mean, I can't speak for the whole country because I don't know the whole country, but people, you know, in our circles and communities, including our children's circles, in a younger generation who are spread around the country and even around the world, how incredibly compliant human beings are. If you had said to anyone a year ago that we would be living in these conditions, people would have said, no way, it's just not possible that human beings could give up so much in this way. And yet it has happened extraordinarily. And of course, there are many examples of it not working perhaps as it should. But if you go across the globe, and I've traveled a little bit, it is astonishing how compliant people tend to be, how adaptable we are in terms of what our expectations are. And actually, I find that quite frightening because I think it sort of opens the door. I mean, both Lyndsey and I work in part on another era back in the 30s and the 40s. And you can see that actually it wouldn't take a whole lot to make most people move back into that mindset. But I think in relation to the essential adaptability and compliance of many human beings is just the catastrophic incompetence of government. I mean, it just makes me weep. Again, going back to the 30s and the 40s, if you look at how the war was prosecuted out of Whitehall, the planning, the meticulous attention to detail, envisaging all sorts of scenarios in terms of planning for the post-war settlement, creating new international organizations, setting up an international military tribunal at Nuremberg. The attention to detail and planning is unbelievable. And in a sense, what you see is the real collapse of a country that has totally lost its way, that has become serially incompetent at the government level, but not perhaps, I think, at the level of other parts of society. So it's a contradiction.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, those are, I think, thoughts and sentiments that will be echoed by a lot of people listening. Philippe, when we come to you, I wonder if you could lean into the microphone a little. I think people were struggling to hear you. I'm looking at the chat and getting that at the same time. Thank you. Subhadra, your surprising revelation.
First of all, that I haven't come out from a heart attack with all the stress about my internet connection going. If I disappear again, don't take it personally. I think the solidarity surprised me as well. And I kind of agree with Philippe, yes and no, in as much as the thing that surprised me was how quickly we adapted to things that had been called for such a long time, but had been ignored as a so-called minority need. So disabled students at UCL, where I work, have been advocating for years for teaching to go digital, for there to be these aspects of online teaching, for things to be made accessible digitally. And it was, and credit to my colleagues who are lecturers and teachers at the university who, over the course of the last 9 months have been working themselves into the ground to try to do this properly. But I'm still amazed as to how quickly we managed it. So hopefully, if good things are going to come out of this situation, that will be one of them, which is that we maintain this level of accessibility of our discourse and of the things that are going on that deserve to have a wider platform.
Yeah, I think it's true that a lot of people have said, even though they feel the strain of sitting in front of Zoom, they know they're including more people, and I think we are probably tonight than we might have been. Joe, same thought. What surprised you?
Well, I've been surprised by many of the things that other people have said, but so as soon as you asked that question, a particular episode came to mind, which was very early on. I don't remember when exactly, maybe February. I was invited to a seminar, and there were a number of mathematical modelers there who were talking about their models of the pandemic. And I remember one of them very patronizingly saying, you know, we're so well off in England, we've got the best modelers in the world. Poor old Germany, there's only one guy, he's part-time and he's really a physicist. And so Germany are really going to struggle, but we're going to be great. You know, we've got this sorted out. And you know, we'd had a lot of success with modeling before. So I went away from that thinking, yeah, okay, these are very bright people. They've got their models, we'll be fine. And then you know, people like Anthony came on TV and were, you know, calling for a much stricter lockdown, much more action. And my friends were saying, have you heard of this man Costello? He's saying we should do this other stuff. I said, oh, Costello, yeah. Who's Costello? And they said, no, he used to run the WHO. And I said, no, he didn't run the WHO. He was in charge of child health and maternal health. He's a child health man. What does he know? There are these modelers who are doing this fantastic work, and they've got it all sorted out. And of course, I was completely wrong, and Anthony was right. And so you didn't know I badmouthed you, Anthony, but I did early on, and my friends were right and you were right, and the modelers were an embarrassment because they had this, some of them anyway, were just very overconfident in their ability to model. They didn't make their model public, or other people didn't use it. They didn't allow it to be discussed in a scientific way. And I think we went wrong for a few weeks at the beginning, maybe longer than a few weeks. So it surprised me that people who had such scientific confidence in what they were doing could be so wrong about it.
I think that's interesting because I think the public had not come to the idea until quite recently that science is contested. There are many different opinions, that evidence is weighed by different groups and so forth. I mean, if one surprise has come out for the general public, it's that there's no such thing as science says. I think that's definitely there. But I can't resist bringing in Karl Friston, who is one of the leading both modelers and critics of other models in the current situation. And Karl, modeling, a difficult thing. We have to remember, as a philosopher, I'm always told by my colleague James Nguyen, models contain propositions that are literally false about the phenomena, but somehow they generate truths. And I wonder whether you think it was about better thinking about models rather than just rushing to models. What's your thought about Joe's remark on modelers getting it wrong?
So I should just say I'm here as Anthony's little helper and his modeler, but I concur exactly with Joe's assessment. I just wanted to say the most surprising thing for me about this pandemic is how quickly time goes. It doesn't seem a few weeks ago since I was, taking down the Christmas tree, and here we are a year later, and that's strange to me and surprising. But in terms of what we're talking about, I think you're absolutely right. What I was surprised to find out was the lack of sophistication in the modelers, and more than that, a surprise that there was such a narrow view of the kind of people that could be advising on the right ways forward. So you talk about SAGE, and you look at the substantive input to SAGE, and it's extremely narrow. It's SPIM and SPIB. So it's great we have behavioral, the B side there. That was a good thing. But just to have these two bilateral, very siloed perspectives. I thought that was surprising, and even more surprising when you actually look at the breadth and the diversity of expertise in the modelling group. That to my mind was very wanting. No expertise in quantifying uncertainty, and as you say, all models are wrong. Models are just hypotheses. So that's how you go into it. I've got this hypothesis, I've got that hypothesis, what's the evidence for it? And what surprised me, that there was no mechanism, and there is no mechanism now in the experts advising SAGE to evaluate the evidence for their hypotheses. So this notion that they are overconfident, I think, spot on. But it's not because they're arrogant, it's because they have no way of measuring the evidence for their hypotheses.
Thank you. I mean, I'm interested and want to come back to you, Anthony, to think about those questions. Who gets to decide which experts we need and who we should have? And I'm wondering whether when you and your colleagues, Karl and others, set up independent SAGE, whether there was thought given to a very different constitution to the group of people who were advising on SAGE.
Yeah, well, the biggest shock to me was the absence of independent public health. I mean, it was after they finally released. I mean, the Guardian had leaked the names of people on SAGE, and then they released the names. And there are some, good people, lots of good people there. But as Karl says, it's behavioral scientists, modelers, and I hate to say this since Jeremy Farrow was nice about me, but, there were 4 medics there. And the problem is that, Sir Mark Walpert had appointed Jeremy Farrow, so Jeremy Farrow, to replace him at Wellcome, had appointed Patrick Vallance, had appointed Chris Whitty. And let's be brutally honest, they're all 4 from the same cloth. They're all clinical academics and good at what they do, but none of them had actual pandemic management or public health experience. So when you also looked at the SAGE, 23 people, 16 were men. There was, I thought there was no Black or minority ethnic group member at all, but people tell me, of course, Jonathan Van Dam was there on the from Public Health England, which of course is not independent, it's government. And his grandfather was a senior Vietnamese official. But, it was, so it was quite skewed. And although we can criticize the modelers, I mean, early on in a pandemic, they don't know much about what's about the virus. They knew enough. I mean, I always say, look, at the end of January, we knew this was a big one. It was spreading incredibly rapidly. It had a unacceptably high fatality rate. We saw the pictures from Wuhan, and therefore that was enough to raise the risk level to incredibly high and get your pandemic plan moving. But then the next problem was who was in charge. And if you'd had, when I was at WHO and we had a crisis team, you would go into the crisis room with panels all round, with people from all over the world chipping in. You'd have a managerial chair, you'd have a leading chair, you'd have clinicians, epidemiologists, communications people, logisticians, primary care experts, mother and child health. We'd all sit there and it would all be discussed, and you would meet every day. And this was during the Zika virus thing. And then you would come back. And so it was very much a cross-disciplinary planning unit. The problem was we had SAGE, who then had this very narrow view, not only of disciplines on it, but of what the role of science was. And most of them say, oh, well, we're just scientists. We just present the facts and let the politicians decide. Well, you can't plan a pandemic with Matt Hancock. He's a politician. He needs to be advised, and you need to have a proper multidisciplinary team, which is why actually you do need lawyers and historians and other people on it, anthropologists particularly.
Well, I'm glad you say that, because I want to come to Lyndsey too. Although I fear that when we move to literary professor, we have to just have a moment's silence for the introduction to Sage of extensive metaphors by Jonathan Van Tam. So we had a
well,
literary there. But Lyndsey, what is missing for you? What is missing from the discussions in Sage? What range of discussions? What ideas? What discourse is just not there that you think we, who all depend on them for the decisions and advice and thinking about what happens next? What would you like to see there?
Yeah, I mean, actually listening to Anthony just now, it's much worse than I had thought. I mean, I thought there'd be a few more social scientists in the room. So I'm kind of taken aback by that. I think, Barry, we're also talking with the humanities rather than the social sciences about what kinds of thinking you need in an emergency situation or in an unprecedented situation. And I've had in the back of my head, there's a quote by the literary critic Elaine Scarry, who wrote a wonderful book actually on torture for the UN. And Elaine Scarry once said, she said, in order to think freely at all, you need to be able to do two things. You need to be able to accurately identify what is the case, and you need to be able to imagine what is not the case. And then she says, and the common names for these two abilities are literature and history. You know, history is accurately saying what's there, and literature is imagining a mental state of not there. So I think the first thing that humanities can bring is a different way of thinking that can help us understand what it is to be so bewildered, what's so overwhelming and very difficult to see. And I think there's been this rush to name and analogize and give precedents that has stopped us from accurately seeing what is there, which goes back to my earlier point about having that anxiety about no longer sharing a reality. And I think you're quite right. I think Joe's got this right too. That means kind of stepping back from models and information. And it certainly means stepping back from thinking that you can model or contrive a normality. There was someone from Whitehall was quoted back in November, and he was saying, it's fine, all we need to do now is to design a new normality for a while. Well, I'm a 20th century cultural and literary historian, and I'm here to tell you that once politicians start designing normalities, we're in real trouble. With this, we have learned. So I think what the humanities can bring is an intense interest in the forms that information gives, which is a key question for literature, and the ways in which we understand the world, ways in which we comprehend the world. And I just want to give quick two examples. You take history first, like Philippe, I spent a lot of my time in the 1930s and 1940s. And when you're training PhD students or postdocs, apprentice historians will always ask the question, is how on earth could they not see what was happening? It was happening right in front of them. What were they doing? Why couldn't they see it? Because they're all, Professor Hindsight when they start. And then you have to say, and this is where moral and political philosophy comes in together with history. You have to say, that is your question. How did they see and not see? What is it, for example, that made eugenics and mass euthanasia seem like okay ideas? How was it that some people became superfluous so quickly? What happened to moral responsibility? And these are our questions too. Those DNRs were signed. Decisions were made about who would get treatment and when. They were made in front of our noses. And the other quote that's come back to me again and again, as you said, Barry, I've been writing this book on Hannah Arendt. There's a passage in the beginning of Origins of Totalitarianism. And she's trying to understand totalitarianism as she keeps on saying again and again, an unprecedented event, an unprecedented thing. And she really lived it. She was a Jewish refugee, so she had her nose like that up to this unprecedented event. And she says, you shouldn't try and deny the shock of what's happening by reaching for precedents or analogies. And then she says, comprehension means an attentive facing up to reality, an attentive facing up to reality, its complexity and its outrageousness. And I think that's what good historians do. That's what they bring. And it's also what writers and artists do. They give us the narrative and imaginative forms to comprehend what can seem completely overwhelming and help us grasp reality, not just as a set of models or set of what do we need to do now, or even as a set of policy, but grasp that kind of reality at a human, historical an existential level. So that's history. Literature comes in, and it's been pointed out a lot. One of the things that's done really well out of the pandemic is the book trade. Book sales have rocketed during the pandemic. People have been reading their backsides off during that pandemic, and not just because they're on their backsides either. Fiction, non-fiction, history, poetry, the lot. And it kept on being said that people were reading to escape the pandemic. And as a literary historian, I just think this was totally the wrong way round. I think people are reading, as they always do, incidentally, to negotiate their way into an extraordinary reality. It's not about escaping. It's about reality testing. It's about entering to another mental space, to go back to that point that, Elaine Skerry says, you need to be able to do that, to think about what's not there. And it's also about dealing with the unknown, producing narratives that help us deal with contingency, but not deny contingency, not deny the reality that we find ourselves in. And I don't think we can overstress how important this kind of thinking is to our lives together, to the human condition. This is a human virus. It attacks us. This is why we need a HAGE, a human advisory group for emergency. And again, I keep on thinking, just one last point, writing, Susan Sontag once said, who was another person who liked to take the humanities right into the front line, she said, writing is a way of conferring and withdrawing meaning and sense upon a life. So it goes back to that question, how do we make some lives mean more than others? I don't think it's any accident at all that Black Lives Matter came with the question of what life was that came with the pandemic. Those two are joined at the hip. And how can we comprehend the reality where we're making those decisions without it actually driving us mad or driving us, and this is where I think we're now, into a massive stage of denial, where we're denying suffering, we're denying death, we're denying, very importantly, grief. So those are the things I think, it's not just the information. I mean, in some ways I'd be appalled with humanities scholars saying, well, they did it this way in 1602, can we try that? And you think, no, not the leeches. But I think it is it's a mode of thinking that the humanities brings that actually takes us out of the drive to model, out of the desire which can be so dangerous to design a new reality or normality.
Thank you. I mean, I hear two things in what you're saying. One of them, the ability to step back, disengage from the sort of urgency of the immediate piling up of evidence or facts, and to reflect. And the other is, instead of stepping back, it's a going forward. It's actually trying to experience and connect to the experiences people have of death, of loss, of grief, of the concern about their future, and how we bring that into the picture. Now, you mentioned, that's why we need HAGE, or the humanities sage, and I'm going to ask Jo about that in a moment. But I want to bring Subhadra in here, because I think there's another question that lurks in this area, which is there's the stepping back and reflecting. There's the experiencing what's going on. The other thing I think is how scholars from the humanities might react to the proposals, the hypotheses, the plans that are sketched out in supposedly scientific terms for politicians to lift and use. And I wonder whether you think it's as easy as picking up some piece of the scientific evidence and then arriving at decisions. Subhadra.
Well, I guess if I thought it was that straightforward, I probably wouldn't be here. And for me, watching this unfold as a historian of science, a historian of eugenics, of race science, it was impossible to hear talk of ideas to do with herd immunity, which were disavowed almost as quickly as they were picked up, and not think that's eugenics. And it was, this is something that is concerning because, of course, as has already been spoken about, it's really difficult to do this in the absence of the politics. And what was very much the case as far as the government is concerned is that you have senior people, if not in the government itself, but certainly very close to the government, who have avowed eugenic positions. They believe that it is possible to pick and choose, to decide in society, in the case of the pandemic, really who gets to live and who gets to die, which is the fundamental premise of eugenics. But more widely, in terms of other kinds of legislations, they are the ones who are legislating for who gets to survive and who gets to thrive. So the idea of herd immunity was, and I completely agreed with this aspect of it, which is that you protect the vulnerable, you protect the elderly and those who are at greater risk of dying from this disease. Although the point was they were supposed to self-isolate in the absence of any kind of meaningful infrastructure. So again, for disabled people, to self-isolate is a very difficult thing if you can't be guaranteed that you're going to be able to support that way of living. But what started to become very clear in the way that this was working was that Black and brown people, as is the case with the prison population in this country, were overrepresented in the number of people who were dying from this disease. And again, looking again to the idea of the history of genetics and where ideas to do with physiognomy, race, and eugenics come from, immediately the first question was, is there something genetic about Black and brown people that make them more susceptible to this disease? Now, I'm not a geneticist. I'm perfectly open to the idea that there might be something genetic. But equally, the fact that it wasn't even considered or wasn't given the same amount of weight, that the fact that Black and brown people, again, they're overrepresented in that term, key workers. They are the people who are working on the front line of the NHS as emergency workers, doctors, nurses. They're at the front line of supermarkets. They're the people driving buses and keeping the transport infrastructure going. The fact that, to me, the very simple fact that these people are overexposed or at greater risk of exposure to the disease, and therefore that's the reason they're dying in greater numbers. The fact that we would think that there was a genetic reason for it seems to me to be to go way, way, way around the houses. And again, this is possibly not surprising given eugenicists sitting at the right hand, whispering as he was into the ear of government. So for me, the fact that the public solidarity was comprised by Dominic Cummings breaking lockdown rules wasn't the shock to me. The thing that was scary was that no one was paying any attention to what he was saying the government should be doing about who we value in society. And I think the onus then is on everyone to be more scientific, because aspects of this work has already been done. Dr. Winston Morgan has spoken at length and in extraordinary detail with a huge amount of passion about why it is that Black people might be suffering from this disease in different kinds of ways. There's a theorist in the States, I'm about to lose her name, Arlene Gerodimus, who's spoken about the topic of weathering, which is the idea that being discriminated against in a society is actually bad for your health, and that might feed into the loop. So it kind of reminded me of, I studied archaeology at university, and when I met the man who would become my father-in-law in my first year, and his son was doing chemistry at the time, one of the first things that he said to me over dinner was, "You're in a hot air balloon with a physicist, a chemist, and an archaeologist, and the balloon is going down. Which one are you going to throw out first?" And as an archaeologist, my response is, why are you interested in killing people before trying to fix the problem?
Nice, thank you. Philippe, I wondered if this echoed with you, whether some of the discussion that was going on, the bandying about of decisions about what to do with various populations, whether that alarmed you, whether as a lawyer you felt a need to respond. I want to ask you that, and then I want to bring Anthony back in on how independent SAGE were responding to the same set of discussions.
Oh, thank you, Barry. I mean, it was a point that I was going to come on to later, but I think one of the things that's been striking to anyone who's involved in regulatory design is the way they've gone about looking at the setting of the rules, with questions really following on from what Subhadra has said about whether they are taking into account the unintended consequences of certain regulatory choices that are being made. I mean, I'm not sure how much lawyers are good for, but one of the things that we are often required to do is to identify particular options for achieving an objective that has been set for us by others who are not in the humanities. You want to achieve X or Y objective. What are the different techniques that are available to you for doing that? What are the carrots? What are the sticks? Do you use economic incentives? Do you use punishment? Do you use the criminal law? Do you use the civil law? And just listening to Subhadra, I'm just reminded that particularly now we're 9 months on, what strikes me is the extraordinary state of confusion we are all in about what we are supposed to be doing. I mean, the community that I live in London tomorrow is about to go into tier 3, we're told. And yet in 4 days after that, we're going to go into some sort of free-for-all, and we've just come out of something else. And the one thing that you know when you're designing rules is, having determined what your objective is, you've got to keep them as simple and as clear as possible. And it's been really interesting to compare. I've divided my time over this period between France and the United Kingdom. Okay, and people in France, frankly, bellyache as much as people in the UK about the inadequacies of the government. But it's really interesting comparing the two sets of approaches. There is real clarity in France. You know exactly what you have to do, for right or for wrong. I'm now in a state of complete confusion. And because I'm in a state of complete confusion, and I know I'm not alone in this, I'm going about setting my own rules for what's a reasonable thing to do in these circumstances. To be really frank, I'm pretty much ignoring now what I'm told to do, because the rules just seem to me to be completely stupid and inconsistent and hopeless in certain circumstances. I'm taking incredible cautions because we have people in our family who are immunosuppressed and who need to be absolutely protected. And so I'm not going to go and, sit in a pub with my mum when I could sit across the room from 5 meters across in an open window and do that. So for me, the reaction is, and I'm not responding really to Subhadra's specific points, it's that something has gone wrong on regulatory design. Keep it simple is the absolutely golden rule. And related to that, it's why we trust judges more than politicians. Put the announcement of what we are supposed to be doing in the hands of people who are not politicians. I know they say that also about the science. Take it out of the hands of the politicians and give it to the scientists, and don't have the politicians standing next to the scientists, whispering in their ear, telling them what they can and cannot say. And they should have done the same thing with the regulatory designs and with the rules. Put it in the hand, find a few retired judges who we really, in a sense, recognize to be independent, not pushing, not looking for re-election, not doing this, to explain what the rules are, how they're going to work, what the consequences will be if you don't follow them. And I think you will get a lot more clarity. So it's the delivery mechanisms as much as the design of the mechanisms that is causing, in the community that I hang around with, just absolute confusion about what is going on.
That's very helpful, and I think it's an important point to keep that regulatory issue in mind, very sort of at the forefront of our mind. When we think of the judges, though, we might not be thinking of Lord Sumption for that task, not necessarily. But Anthony, I want to come to you, and I want to take up Subhadra and Philippe's comments. One is the political sensitivity of any of the issues that came up and how much they were discussed by your group on Independent Sage. And then the second thing is, if we do take the stance of saying, let's keep politicians out of it, let's just let it be run by the epidemiologists, we seem to end up in the position that Sweden's in. Sweden has done that. There's a standing back by government, there's a standing back by the royal family. They haven't come out to speak. They've said, well, we need the experts to do it. Hasn't necessarily gone terrifically well. So I wanted you just to reflect on both of those things, if you would.
Gosh, yeah. So first, a whole number of issues you touched on about race, about class, about vulnerability. Sir David King, and political influence. So Sir David King first got really worried when he learned, you know, he was a former chief government scientist, and he learned that Dominic Cummings and a couple of his sidekicks were sitting in on independent stage meetings. And he said, this is beyond the pale, because you have to be independent and you have to be able to give, you know, straight talking. And he talked a lot about what he did with Blair and Brown and the like. And so when we got going, and I was massively concerned about the lack of a public health voice, an independent public health voice. There were people from Public Health England, but it didn't seem that they were following what WHO had said from day one, which is very basic. It's find the virus, test, find, trace the contacts, and isolate them. And then on top of that, you do social distancing and hand washing and all the rest of it. And then in desperate circumstances, you do lockdowns. But what you really want to do is basics of public health is lock down the infection and the contacts, and then you break the transmission. Now, that's what China had done. I mean, there was a report published on February the 24th, which showed how within a month they really got on top of this through a mixture of, you know, lockdowns in Wuhan and Hubei, but also devolution of power to the other states, massive education campaigns, massive tracing. They brought 9,000 tracers within 2 weeks into Wuhan to cover 11 million. When we discovered in February how much we, you know, tackled to contact tracing, it was 270 people for 55 million. I mean, we just didn't really mobilize, and it wasn't even thought through about that. We didn't try to scale up testing, even though it was clear from Korea that had 2 outbreaks, rather like we had London and the West Midlands, they had 2 provinces. They went in, bang, and tested as much as possible. They were only doing 20,000 a day at the peak, but they managed to lock it down, and then they got it under control. And if you look right now at China, and, you know, China and South Korea have death rates of 3 per million and 9 per million, I think it is now for South Korea. They've had a little spurt. We're at 950 per million. We're worse than America. So, you know, it was possible to suppress this. Gabriel Scally, who's on Indy Sage, says, you know, we're an island. We could have controlled our borders better. That would have required lawyers to be on board to talk about all of those aspects of rights. But, you know, the other key thing WHO always said, act fast. Don't wait for, you know, modelers are important, but you bring the team together, you've got to move fast. And we'd had a pandemic plan, we'd had this exercise sickness, but it was soporific, our movement. And, you know, I mean, I remember pulling my hair out when the budget was on March the 11th. And they'd already reported that Nadine Dorries, who was the junior minister, had been infected, I think 9 days earlier. Yeah. So sticking everyone into Parliament was, I mean, where was the public health person saying this can't happen? And of course, we almost wiped out our entire high command. So anyway, back to what did Indy Sage say? Well, on the black issue, we were very keen to have proper representation. We have Zubaydah Haq from the Runnymede Trust, Kamlesh Kunti, who's a GP professor who's done some great work on this, Dean and Pillay, and you know, and we really, and you know, Subhadra is absolutely right that this is not about genetics. It's about exposure, and it's about class, and it's about being in the front line and doing the jobs that other people don't want to do very often. And even amongst the middle class doctors, they had higher rates because they were in the unfashionable hospitals doing a lot of the really nasty stuff without adequate PPE and the like. But then finally, on that, I'll stop in a minute about herd immunity. Look, herd immunity is what you get from a vaccine. And it's very interesting because some viruses like measles, which are incredibly infectious, you need 95% coverage to really get control of the virus. For flu, it's going to be much less. Smallpox was eradicated because it was much less infectious, you know. But herd immunity is also interesting because it does interact, and Karl will talk very knowledgeably about this, but it's not a strategy. I mean, name me a virus where you just let it rip. You don't, unless it's trivial, you know. And so and they all backtracked about a week later. They said, oh no, it was never a strategy. But it clearly was. They said, well, we're going to have 400,000 people die. And that was when the Sky interviewer, you know, Beth Rigby asked Chris Whitty, you know, he said, well, look, hang on, 60% people get it, 1% mortality rate, that's 400,000 people. And he said, well, yeah, but, you know, and one of the modelers had said, yeah, we need a really good epidemic, as though it was some kind of, you know, epidemiological war game. And pandemics have always killed more than wartime. I mean, we've lost more people than during the Blitz. So we, you know, we should treat it with great urgency and act fast. I'll stop.
Absolutely, thank you. Before I come to Joe, I want to get thoughts and reflections on this. I want to encourage people to put questions in the Q&A button. If you go to the bottom of your screens and find the Q&A, please do put questions in. We'll still have time to get them out. Joe, I want to raise the issue that's coming out here and that Anthony and Philippe have both raised, and that is, you know, that scientists from however wide or small a range of expertise, they come together, they discuss, and then the politicians have to make decisions. And I'm very interested in that join and who polices that join, and in fact, how we think about how that should work. Because it seems to me there's a sort of mythical view that either we follow the science tells us we are just taking it on, or else the other view, which is the politicians that are in there all the time putting pressure on the scientists to say, come up with the range of options that we can tolerate. So how are we to think about that join, and whose job is it to look at that join?
Well, I think this is a question that's debated even by the people in, you know, making those decisions. Because I can remember being involved in a committee of chief economists who were looking at the value of life and the value of health and trying to come up with a joint recommendation. And definitely some of them thought they were telling politicians what to do. And others thought, no, they were putting the options on the table because they were the technicians. And it was only the politicians who had the democratic mandate that it would be somehow authoritarian for the scientists and civil servants to be instructing outside the political process. So there's certainly a view that politicians need to be there. Why do they need to be there? Well, this view, I think, a rather naive view, was that in a democracy, only the politicians have the legitimacy to make the decision. And that can't be completely right because they can delegate some of them to experts. But I definitely think that there's room for people who are not coming just from one discipline to make the decision, because you could be captive by your own discipline. So if you're an economist, you're going to be looking at one type of issue. If you're a lawyer, you're going to be looking at another type of issue. If you're an epidemiologist, you're going to be looking at another type of issue. Everything in public policy is a matter of balance. So we need people who respect the science, but don't feel that they're dictated by it. And I think this is really difficult because one thing I've seen in around people who are trying to make an honest contribution, very often people already have their view about what is required, and they look for scientific support for it. And you can find it, because you can pretty much find a scientist saying more or less whatever you want. And so you can go around, you can find one study that supports the view you have, and so you can get that, wave it around and say, look, here's my scientist who supports my position. And I think we've seen in the last few days, the government has been guilty of this, that it went around and found the right scientists. And this is called confirmation bias, and it's probably the thing that we all fall into it all the time. Many of us try to guard against it by reading people we disagree with or reading a variety of things. but pretty much everyone will be looking for evidence to support their view, rather than looking at all the evidence and seeing what is the conclusion to draw on the balance of all of the evidence. And this is true for politicians as much as anyone else. So I think what we need, I mean, is, well, if we had Aristotle here, he would say it's about having people with the right character, not necessarily the right knowledge. So we need people we can trust, rather than people who have learnt the right things. And we see this quite interestingly in the contrast between our Prime Minister and the situation in Germany. So there in Germany, Merkel goes on television and she explains things in a way that is simple enough for ordinary people to understand, but also seem to have a scientific credibility to them. Whether or not she's right, she conveys that message that she's listened to the scientists. She's in a position to understand. She's not only listening to the scientists, she's listening to other things too, and coming to a rounded view on the basis of everything. So I would say it's a matter of the character. And last thing I'll say, I was asked to write about the pandemic as early as April. And at that time, some countries were doing well and others were doing badly. So Israel was doing very well at that time. And then a bit later on, things went wrong for them. And I said that it's far too early to tell which countries are going to be the most successful, but it's not too early to tell which countries have got trustworthy leaders. And we know how different countries have done in that respect.
I think we're going to come back to the question of confidence in government and trust in government, which is hugely important all around the world, as you say. But yes, the issue of character. So, Aristotle said, don't ask a mathematician for a poem and don't ask a poet for a proof. And that seems good advice. So we've got people with different ranges of expertise and different ways of thinking, as Lyndsey talked about. But I'm wondering how you then put them together. I mean, either you've got another independent sage-like body, which has got all the humanities folk commenting, and whether or not that would have any impact on the main decision-making. But if you bring humanities scholars, lawyers, philosophers, literary scholars, and so on into the discussion, they work at such different timescales. And I'm wondering how you do the gearing so that they can actually engage and so that there is benefit of one talking to the other. So any thoughts about that, Joe? Because I think that gearing and the different timescales causes a really difficult problem.
So I think the different timescales is one type of difference. So I've been on a number of committees, cross-disciplinary committees. I've been involved in a number of policy areas in different ways. One thing that quite often happens is that governments or departments like to ask economists, because economists give you an answer. They give you a recommendation. If you go to an economist, you're going to be told what to do, roughly speaking. And then you see some of the reports that come out, some of the recommendations, and they seem rather narrow or wooden. So humanities scholars, social scientists quite often criticize. And I've seen a couple of cases where the people commissioning a report have said, actually, these are good criticisms. Let's get the anthropologists in. Let's get the sociologists in. Let's get the historians in. And of course, first thing, they don't deliver to deadline. So they're asked to do their report and it goes on and on. It's far too long. And the conclusions are always the same, which is this is far more complicated than people in other disciplines think. We don't have enough knowledge. We need more money for research, right? And so if you've got that attitude, the government is going to be maybe interested, but they're not going to turn to you in a crisis or an emergency. So we need people who are prepared to put their discipline to one side to some degree and listen to others. I mean, you and I have been on enough committees, academic committees, where you hear an academic saying, well, it's not really important, but I do have an objection to that. And if you had a business person doing that, you say, get out of the room. We don't have time for that. But for academics, our trade in stock is the counterexample and finding the problem. And if something is not 100% correct, it's wrong. Whereas in public life, if you've got something that's about 65% right, you're doing pretty well. So it's always easy to point out counterexamples and problems. So we need people who are prepared to bring something, but also not insist that they're the only person who can be right, and to compromise and work with others, and also speak other people's language, which is quite hard. So we, that idea of translating across disciplines, and actually quite often it's the humanities scholars who can do this. We're used to listening to different types of discourse, and catch on quickly and can understand one person's discourse and explain it to another. So I think we can be there as a moderating factor. We can bring things together, we can bring in values, we can bring in history, which is important. Even if we're not going to do what they did in 1602, it can be quite useful to know what happened in 1602. So we can have these narratives and comparisons, try to bring things together. But there's no formula for any of this. You have people in a room, and if you're lucky, a consensus emerges. But it could, at the same time, all of us know consensus can emerge, and we will go away and we say, well, that's not what I would have done. Right? So we can have a groupthink consensus as well, where people are just doing something to get it settled rather than think that it's right. So there are no secrets here, but people have to put their ego to one side, they have to put their discipline to one side, they have to respect others and be prepared to make a compromise.
Yeah, I think those are good lessons and difficult to apply sometimes. I'm reminded that when humanities colleagues always say, well, we do things differently. You often hear the medics say, well, we know you do things differently. Can you just tell us what it is you do? And can you give us a definite answer? And a worry is coming back with, as my colleague Chris Frith and a colleague of Karl's, Chris Frith, says, you mustn't just come back and say, well, it's all very, very difficult. There's got to be something more than that. And I'm wondering if we can bring in Karl, who's been very patient here, whether these questions that stand back or say, let's think about this, or let's introduce some distinctions you hadn't thought of, or let's question some of the fundamental assumptions. Would they be of use to you? Can you stream them in as you're doing the things that you're required to do with urgency on SAGE?
Yes, yeah, practically. Just a technical answer to that question. The big challenge behind the kind of modelling which underwrites a lot of our recommendations and forecasting is nothing to do with epidemiology. It's all about interpersonal, intercommunity fluxes, behavioral responses. It's 99% the way that we as human beings respond to the virus being in the population. So, that's I think a really pragmatic example of the importance of a more eclectic view of the system at large, of which we are part, and our behavior, defining the dynamics of that system to make any sensible comments about what will happen. For example, vaccination. Vaccination with a compliant, informed population is completely different as a ball game from vaccinating a herd of cows. But more generally, just to address your question, there is a position in terms of leveraging and getting the kind of insights and more eclectic perspective on the problems from the humanities, that the way that the path to impact is not through government. And in fact, the path to impact is to do exactly what you are doing now. And I think the independent SAGE is a good example of that. I personally, and I think a lot of people would agree with me, that the impact of independent SAGE has been absolutely zero. And I know this to be true from the point of SBIM. I have a letter from number 10 explaining why they don't want to extend the modelling group. But more generally, we've had absolutely no impact on government decisions at all. But we've had enormous impact in terms of a public understanding and enabling and informing, and also providing moral support for other invested people, stakeholders, other areas of expertise. And I would submit that that's the way you make a difference, not by worrying about influencing number 10. I can tell you some horror stories about what's going on at the moment. I mean, all the issues in terms of the decision making are really current. They're not resolved. I know the kind of trade-offs that people are trying to use at the moment to balance the quality of their life against the economic cost in terms of quality adjusted life years. I've seen the Excel spreadsheets. They are currently being discussed now to decide whether we go from level 2 to level 3 by a handful of people. And they don't come from academia. they come from the people who the government listened to, which is the rebellious Conservative Party members, and particularly the COVID recovery group. These are the people in charge of making governmental decisions. So you're not going to impact that. And I would submit that not very important, because what is important is the way that we as a population understand what's going down. And 99% is basically Philippe's doing the right, sensible thing in an informed way, in a compassionate, sensible way, by listening to the people he trusts. It's got nothing to do with what the government. If that's right, it's more important to have these sessions day after day after day, bringing in all the points that you are making. I think that's probably going to have a much more impact than sort of worrying about an interface between SAGE and the Cabinet Office, to be quite honest.
Good. I see Lyndsey's in agreement. I want to bring Lyndsey and then Subhadra in on that, because I'm wondering whether or not you're both as contented with getting the public on side but leaving SAGE untouched in this way. I mean, I think you're right, Karl, that there's very little impact, but going inside that room doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be listened to or heard if it's not going in the direction that the majority of people in there want it to go. But Lyndsey and then Subhadra.
Yeah, I just, Karl, that was exactly what my fear and feeling is. I mean, two things to pull out from what you said. The first was the current discussions on QALYs and quality of life is truly chilling. And in some ways, I wouldn't want to get into a room and be involved in those discussions as a humanities scholar or indeed as a humanist. But I think you're also absolutely right, is where where the humanities and the arts need to target. Maybe government can create more space for this, or we can start lobbying for more space of this, is in public life, in the lives we are living. And that's where things are so crucial, like care, like respect for life, like intimacy. And that's where I think the humanities are really already making a difference. I think it's also really telling that if you look at research after research, it doesn't work for the States, but it works for the UK. If you ask people, and this is research that's being done at King's at the moment, the money or life question, which you value more, the economy or life, it's fairly much, it doesn't follow on leave remain lines. It doesn't really follow on party lines. There's a bit of variation in age. The only people who seem more willing to give up lives for money tend to be the very rich and the better educated. So there's not a politics of this in the way that's being made out. There is something that's been worked out on the ground about a common humanity that the humanities can work with and respond to. And those questions are not just around governance and politics, they're also existential. I mean, the bit of research that was done recently, again, the same team at King's, saying that trust in government has gone down since news of the vaccine. And, me with my kind of philosophy head on thinks, well, that's existential. That's saying because we don't need to rely on you anymore because there's something else. And, and not only, and as Philippe said, the disastrous chaos, thoughtless chaos of our government would be another reason. But that seemed to me there is something that we're missing here, where we've got the social and the behavioural and science, and we've got policy and governance, and there's this bit in the middle where most of us live, which is how we're engaging with one another, with decision making, with care, with shared mourning, with collective responsibility. And my answer to do you need more humanities? Yes, but we need more humanities education so we can take that into the world and make it more forceful. Thank
you. Subhadra.
Yeah, I thought, because I've been thinking about what I was going to say here and considering this question and what I was going to contribute. And I thought the thing that I came up with has surprised me, but I also thought it was going to be controversial in a way that it clearly isn't. Which is that I don't think I want my expertise to be available to this government in particular, but generally any government, because, well, particularly given how venal and base this particular government is, I feel like if we give them greater information about how to be more efficient eugenicists, we're not necessarily helping ourselves. But yeah, the collective power, our common humanity. The number of people that I know who have been volunteering in food banks or have been, just making sure that their neighbours or and people who have to stay at home were getting groceries and making those efforts within the community. Solidarity in our society is the thing that is going to be causing the shift, because yeah, it turns out that we don't really elect the politicians that we need or that we deserve. We're going to have to do these things for ourselves. And we also know that politicians, even if presented with accurate scientific research and information, don't necessarily act on it. Just go and ask David Nutt. And so it's not really about them at the end of the day. There are more of us than there are of them. It's down to us to be there for each other. And yeah, if the thing that people found surprising at the beginning of this was just how much solidarity there was in the community, then hopefully there is cause for hope there.
Thank you. I want to bring in a question now. Emma Obermeyer is asking in the chat, and I think I'll direct this to you, Philippe, whether there's any role for public decision-making involving the public in having these decisions. I mean, we're trying to think of which range of experts would we like and who would we like to reply to them, but what about public involvement?
I mean, public involvement can operate in a number of different ways. One first and simple way is the question of whether you want the public to be able to observe the process of deliberation without actually being involved in it. I mean, it is one thing to make minutes or redacted minutes of SAGE available long after the event. It's quite another thing to say, actually, let's just put this on Zoom. Everyone can watch what the debates are and listen to what the debates are. And there would be different concerns about that. One would be that people would then behave differently. I mean, we get this issue in whether to make legal proceedings open to the public or not. And there is an argument that by making it widely available, in other words, not just allowing 20 members of the public into the room, which would be one way of doing it, another way of doing it is just broadcasting it on the web. It causes people to behave differently. That's not necessarily a bad thing. So that's one option. Another option is, of course, going to the other end of the extreme, having the public vote on decisions to be taken, having them to vote in the tiniest of communities, that's to say their own family, a village, a town, a borough of Camden, a borough of London. You can imagine all sorts of different ways of dealing with this. I mean, there are practicalities, but I think one of the things that has not worked is we've understood that there appears to be a relationship between the degree of transparency in decision making and people's acceptance of the output of that process. And so I'm not sure I'd go to the extreme of having all members of the public, i.e. the whole of the United Kingdom or England or Wales or Northern Ireland or a particular town or region voting on, do we want to be tier 1, tier 2, tier 3? Because you can imagine the pandemonium. We have a system of sort of delegated government making. But I would be really interested in seeing what goes on in the room.
Yeah.
Who's speaking? Frankly, I just switched off watching the presentations very early on because I formed the impression that they were not authentic. And they were not authentic because no one was taking responsibility for mistakes that have been made. And no one was saying we've made mistakes. I don't know whether that's an Anglo-Saxon system, but it's really interesting to compare Germany and France, where the politicians say, actually, yeah, we got it wrong. We thought we would have this consequence if we did X, Y, or Z, but we didn't realize it would also have consequences A, B, and C. And we take responsibility, blame us. I literally can't bear to listen to them because they don't take responsibility. And frankly, the same is true of the scientists. There's one of the scientists in particular, I'm sorry, I'm going to say it, Mr. Valens, I simply don't trust him. He comes from a corporate background. My mates in the scientific community basically say he was a second-rate bloke in the corporation that he worked for, and they basically pushed him out, to pasture because he wasn't up to it. And I'm looking, I watch him and you sort of begin to get a sense of who is plausible and who's not plausible, and then having a politician parked right next to them, sort of keeping a very close eye on what they do and do not say, is, I think, very compromising. So I think the furthest that I would go in terms of public input, and I think it would be very significant, is to make the decision-making transparent.
Yeah, that seems worth doing. And I'm very glad that you are a lawyer when you're saying these things in public about sympathetic balance. And but I agree with you. I think many people did switch off. They felt the inauthenticity and the stage management was too much. And yet it was important to notice that. And it was important that people could see when they were not having a satisfactory answer. I think it was also important that they could judge the lack of responsibility taken. And a few of us have seen little glimmers of spine in Chris Whitty in not necessarily taking everything that the politicians and Sir Patrick Vallance say. So these things are important. Being in the room to watch, cameras in there would be extraordinary. But I want to offer another question from the audience, and this I think goes to you, Anthony. So Adrian Simon asks, do you not think part of the reason for the success of China's efforts to suppress the pandemic was that they could control people more readily? And it wasn't about trust in government, it was just sheer ability to control people's behavior.
Yeah, I actually typed something back to that. It's certainly true that China is a more controlling and, in part repressive society. About the Uyghurs and all the rest of it. I mean, there's no question about that. Having said that, they did, so they locked down Wuhan and Hubei pretty ruthlessly. But I say ruthlessly, they brought in enough people to ensure, but they also protected all their population financially. Everyone was told that their bills would be paid. They were allowed out to go to food or in the other states. Let's start with the other states. Devolved power. They were told what they had to do. They had 24-hour TV channels talking about the data, the issues, what they all needed to do. They all had their bills paid, including TV and their rentals and all the rest of it. They provided food and pharmaceuticals for everyone. So there was a collective will. And most people, when the WHO went round, and we could get onto WHO, but we mustn't actually, WHO has had, in my view, a pretty good pandemic. I mean, and they only were allowed into China on February the 16th. So that's more than 2 months after the first case, and they should have been allowed in straight away. But in their report, they lay out that actually what China did was remarkable once they got their act together. They didn't say, well, you were completely hiding everything for about a month, which they can't because they're a member state organization. They don't do that. I mean, that's UN diplomacy, I'm afraid. But having said that, a lot of things that China did from a public health point of view, I personally believe were not impossible in our society. Early on we said, if you want to isolate people, firstly, you've got to financially support them. We still don't. We give people about £7 an hour or something in order to go and isolate for 14 days. 5 million people in the gig economy.
Yeah.
And they just can't do it. So they lie about it. I mean, they're doing mass testing in Liverpool, and only 4% of the really poor communities are taking a test. Why? Because they don't want to isolate.
They can't afford it. I'm wondering whether, especially when you start to think about how communities are differentially affected with the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 divisions, and Philippe warned us about too much fragmentation and fractionation going down to the borough of Camden for a decision. But I wonder, Anthony, if you are in favor of something which one of your colleagues, David Price, has advocated, and that's having more chief scientific advisors for regions. If you actually had a chief scientific advisor for Manchester or Greater Manchester, if you had this in the way that the devolved nations do, there might be a way of at least contesting or trying to press a little harder on what information is coming out of SAGE. Would that be a good idea, do you think?
Certainly. Well, look, public health is about the social determinants of health, the economics of health. It's about rights, it's about ethnicity, it's about the environment, and it involves sciences, social sciences, medicine, and of course, humanities. And therefore, having people that reflect that, advising the politicians locally, and having a devolved system of administration is extremely important. My only qualification is, one of the problems that's happened in the UK in the last 10 years is they came in, they said, we have to have government scientific advisors. So they all got appointed to each ministry, and a load of them sat on SAGE, but of course they're then government employees. And if you're sitting there and Patrick Vallance is your boss, or Whitty's your boss, and Dominic Cummings is sitting there, you're not independent. The day I arrived in WHO, I was told you're not independent anymore. Your job is to convene meetings. You can chip in, but basically we listen to the independent SAGE advice.
But if your boss is Andy Burnham, would that be an advantage?
Well, I think Andy would be a bit better. I like the idea of people being brought in and doing it sort of on a gratuitous basis, you know, that they're not paid employees, because once you do that, I think it silences people. You know, you could have chosen almost anyone from the public health community to sit on that SAGE, and they would have contested at the very first meeting the idea that you don't test and that you don't set up a different kind of tracing system. I haven't met a public health person that wouldn't have said that.
Okay, I've got limited time. We're going to have to wave goodbye to Karl, who, thank you very much for joining us, Karl Friston. You have to be elsewhere, I know, but thank you.
Still on Zoom.
Joe, could I just raise a question with you, and then we'll have a last question, which we may have to do in a quicker way than I'd hoped. But James Wilson asks, should we have a chief humanities advisor?
Well, I'm sure there are some people who would apply for that job. I don't think it's one I would want myself. I mean, even the idea of a chief scientific advisor is rather strange. If you think about all the sub-disciplines of science, it has to be someone who knows who to call on, what expertise to call on. I'm not sure in the humanities whether expertise works in the same way. I tend to think that, well, yeah, I mean, it is fascinating. One of the first committees I was on was looking at the scientific experiments on animals. And what happened was that there were 15 scientists, all who'd been working on this area all their life, and me as an ethicist, supposedly, who'd never looked at the issue at all. And so I asked, why do they ask for experts in science and a non-expert in ethics? And they said the problem was that if you've got an expert in ethics, you've already chosen the result by the choice of that person. Because if someone comes with an ethical view, then they're not going to change it in the committee. So what you need is someone who can evaluate arguments, can look at the evidence, can look at the best arguments. And in that circumstance, you need one type of person. A different circumstance, you need someone else. So I don't know, I'd never thought of having a chief humanities officer. Maybe James or someone else might be able to persuade me of the advantages, but at the moment I'm a bit skeptical.
Okay, now last thing, and I'm afraid this has to be quick. We're coming close to the end of our meeting and occasion talking together. But the thought is, many things have been revealed. There have been changes in the esteem given to low-paid workers who were essential and who we depended on. There have been revelations that the people who've been most lonely in this period were the young and not the old, that actually sort of 14 to 22 have found it particularly hard. And also we know that Black and ethnic minority communities have suffered more. And we also know that poverty has been a big issue in how unequal the effect of COVID-19 has been. And I'm wondering, whose job is it to ensure that these things are not forgotten and are taken forward, that they're kept in mind. In some way, we need to keep urgency without emergency. We have to keep these issues live. They have to be as urgent as they've been, but without a pandemic to drive people and make them think about it. How will they be remembered? So I want to have a quick round. Maybe public inquiries are one of the ways, but I'm sure we've all felt less faith in decisions come to and subsequently ignored. But I'm going to have a quick round of all of you to just think about that question. I'll start with you, Philippe.
Well, I mean, you've asked me to address the question of, an inquiry and where we might head. I mean, we're still in the midst of matters. It's plain, I think most people you speak to from across the political spectrum, that things have not perhaps gone as they should go. And so the question does arise, what is the best way to learn lessons? We're told by our scientific colleagues, this is not the last such pandemic that we're going to face. We need to be in a better position to understand where we are going to head. An inquiry is one way to do that, but you immediately reach the challenging questions. What are the terms of reference? Who is going to actually participate as the members of the inquiry panel? Who picks the members of the inquiry panel? Is there much evidence that prior inquiries have changed practices across time? The inquiry I was most recently connected with is the Chilcot inquiry on Iraq. We saw how incredibly long that took with an overbroad term of reference. And I think one of the lessons from that is we need to ratchet down to understand very precisely what are the issues on which the maximum amount of difference could be made by learning the lessons. That's outside of my expertise as to what the answer to that question is. But it seems to me that is one area in which the humanities can provide very significant assistance. If you want bang for your buck, how do we make sure that next time this happens, we're in a better position to do it? I suspect that's not something in which our friends in the scientific community will be able to contribute a great deal on, because it goes to the nature of decision-making processes. And the nature of decision-making processes is something that different disciplines of the humanities know a little bit about and can bring something to bear on. Or it could be what could have been done differently to bring the public along with us. It could be a very narrowly focused inquiry. Again, that's one set of issues, I think, in which, behavioral psychologists and psychoanalysts and philosophers and economists and regulatory experts and sociologists can help us in a way what actually informs human behavior to get a more decent outcome. But I think what I'm saying to you is the idea of an overarching mega inquiry that looks at the totality of what has gone wrong is not likely to be useful in a time-sensitive sense. And I think the area the humanities can help is to find the bite-sized chunks, key critical issues where a bit of time-limited thinking can have a significant impact on the lessons learned. I don't know what those are, but that's where I would start. If we were to do this again, what would be the micro issues where we could make a difference? I'm afraid I too am going to have to run at 7:30, but I thank you, Barry, for your wonderful chairing, and all colleagues. It's been a real privilege to listen to a range of different views.
Thank you very much for being here, and that was a great contribution to take forward. So thanks again, Philippe. Much obliged and grateful to you. Thank you. Let's go to Subhadra to have a response to that. The things that we think humanities scholars might do. I mean, I thought there's a lovely point by Philippe that actually humanities scholars might be very well placed to think about the issues we want to ask and we want to press.
I'm going to answer that by answering the previous question, which is whose job is it? And my answer to that is it's mine. So I am a historian. I have ambitions of being a public historian. And so it's my responsibility to make sure that the things that I do within the academy are as accessible in terms of language, in terms of platform, in terms of all those other things outside as well. And yeah, I think we've cottoned on to the fact that sometimes an academic approach, which is to be able to find fault or to find counterexample, is the way in which we're trained. But maybe we can also be a bit more ambitious about finding solutions and also acknowledging and self-including to be able to say, well, you know what, if you didn't ask us, we still have thoughts. We're going to be telling you them anyway.
Good. I think you already are a public historian. I wouldn't worry about becoming one.
Thank you.
Lyndsey.
Yes, I think, just to echo, I mean, on the question, yes, public humanities, but I also think actually in some ways public humanities is an oxymoron. The clue is in the name, it's humanity, and I think the very idea, a lot of what's gone wrong with disciplinary thinking is actually severing that connection. So you're absolutely right on that. And I also think, Philip was bang on the money there about inquiries. I mean, I've been watching the Grenfell inquiry very carefully for other reasons. And I think Grenfell and our current situation are continuous. I think there's a continuity there, which is a continuity around thoughtlessness, which is a continuity about structural inequality, which is a continuity about thinking that some lives do not matter as much as others. And the problem with having an inquiry is, how are we going to name the crime? How are we going to name what we've done here, what we're doing? So as with Philippe, I would be sort of very, very cautious about that. And as I said before, I think, one of the reasons one of the things that has been exposed is our human vulnerability. And this happens several times over history. There are points where it becomes kind of almost unbearable, human vulnerability. And it is quite often the arts, the humanities that give forms, that give narratives, that tell stories about that vulnerability, that enable us to create resilience, which is not a word I use lightly because I don't often like it, but a kind of cultural and political and human resilience. And that, I think, is the job of education, it's the job of local politics, and it's the job, just as you said, of teachers and writers.
Well worth being reminded of that vulnerability in times when we're not facing something like a crisis. And I think you're right. And the worry is that a lot of people thought that COVID was maybe the pandemic coming upon us as a time to rethink and reset. And I think also there are fears that we won't reset. I think that's a very live issue. So Anthony, how do we keep the lessons learned, the things that we need to attend to in view?
Well, I think there are different time spans here. So first, I actually think I would do a technique that has been incredibly successful in medicine for maternal mortality, stillbirths and things. It's called a confidential inquiry. And I would do that for public health, particularly around SAGE and the administration of this pandemic. Because if you do it confidentially with a no blame culture, you get people to open up much more. So that's one thing I would think seriously about doing. Secondly, I think the select committees did a very good job. I think the Health and the Science and Technology Committee, both chaired by Conservatives, Greg Clark and Jeremy Hunt, but they did a good job and they really did hold a lot of people to account and didn't, gave them a tough time. So that was good. I think there must be a public inquiry of some description. My fear is it will go on for 4 or 5 years and everyone will have left and it will all be, but you need it in order to really get, it's better than a Royal Commission. And finally, I think the historian's view, I think, what Subhadra is going to do and others, and the literary view. I mean, there's going to be a huge amount come out, I think, on the lockdown and what happened. You'll see novels appearing. But finally, I just want to leave one thought. We're not through this. Oh. We've got a massive economic shock coming. We've, 80% of the world's jobs have been affected by this. And 1.2 billion children have been furloughed for education. It's the biggest financial shock we've had in 300 years. And this is not going to go away. There's a real disconnect between the stock market and the economy right now. And I think we're going to have a very torrid year, even if the vaccine is probably a way out. assuming that everything goes smoothly in terms of not suppressing, but getting down to an endemic equilibrium, as Karl would say.
Yeah. Notwithstanding Brexit. Joe, I'm going to give the final word to you. So your thoughts about.
Okay, that's always dangerous. But I think, Barry, you may remember when we were young, politicians used to accuse each other of promising a better yesterday, and that we can spend a lot of time working out how we would have done the same thing better if it came up again. I think we have to do that, but more urgent is to work out a better tomorrow. And I think this was a point of your question, that we're learning lessons about racial disparities in health, in vulnerability, risk exposure. What do we do about it? And I think, you know, we could go back and think about the rise of the welfare state at the end of the Second World War. You know, what happened? There was a combination of factors. It wasn't one thing, but there was vision, communication, leadership, and public support. So that's what we need. We need a political movement that will ignite public support, and they need the vision and communication of people from the humanities, among others. So we should look forward as well as back.
Thank you, and I'm glad you allude, without naming, to Beveridge, whose hall in the University of London Senate House we would all be in, were we not under these strange conditions. So it's nice to have Beveridge's name in front of us. I want to just remind everyone that the Open for Discussion panels will go on. They will go on in the next couple of weeks and months, and you can find information about that from the School of Advanced Study website, and we might even post something into the chat for you as well. I'd like to thank all of you who've joined and watched and listened to this discussion. Keep the thoughts going. Send us thoughts. Do join in further discussions that we'll try to keep alive on this topic, because we've raised a lot of issues, but we've more thinking to do. But I'm particularly grateful to my panelists, to Lyndsey Stonebridge, to Subhadra Das, to Joe Wolff, to Philippe Sands, and a brief appearance by Karl Friston, but most especially to Anthony Costello, who stepped in at the last moment and ably filled the role. You were invaluable, and we're very glad that we had you here. So thanks to all, and that's it for this Open for Discussion panel. Good night.
Thanks very much. Good night.